I kind of see ourselves almost as if we're like watchmakers. We're there with our microscope, pulling, pushing, cleaning, reorganizing, and making sure that it's a well-oiled machine. I think I have a pretty broad philosophy around operations. I think some portion of it is that it's a necessary function that as companies sort of grow and expand, they're becoming more aware of the fact that it's really hard to do business without a good ops function. Um, we are in this environment today where we're just asked to do more with less, or even sort of significantly less. And we see these sort of, 5-person companies be able to sort of pivot and be flexible and execute things that enormous companies can't really move with that level of mobility with.
Mm.
And the ability to sort of put in structure and identify leaks and sort of be able to have this overarching view of the business as a whole, and then be able to sort of dive into wherever you need to dive into to get um, that process sort of working seamlessly. Like I kind of see ourselves almost as if we're like the watchmakers. So
Mm.
each section is a cog, and we're sort of there, sort of with our sort of microscope, like pulling, pushing, cleaning, reorganizing, and making sure that it's a well-oiled machine, because we
Mm.
are essentially sort of building our machinery for better business, right?
Mhm. That is really cool. I like the way that you put it. Really, with an example, it's easier to kind of visualize what the ops function actually does. So let's move on to metrics, which is the theme of discussion. What would you say the core metrics are for you? And do you feel like this differs from company to company?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's kind of the crux, right? Which is each company is different. I think that depending on the size of the company, depending on the culture of the company, depending on sort of what the customers are looking for, what the executives are looking for,
Mm.
your what you need to focus on, what metrics you need to start looking at are actually foundationally different. I mean, I think that there's something to be said for like ops kind of being relatively similar across the board, but industries greatly differentiate between what you're actually looking at. And in addition to industries, it's even like the same industry, the same company, but working with B2C versus B2B.
Mm.
It's an entirely different war zone, essentially. And so
Mm.
being able to sort of identify what those metrics are for those different businesses is very key. And I think one thing is that a bigger business, or sort of a business with a longer sales cycle, with a smaller number of customers and a higher deal cycle, is oftentimes a lot easier to sort of build better metrics around, because it's less sort of, there's less white noise. So if
Mhm.
you ever think about that sort of notion of sort of like almost high level math, where you have that scatter plot and there's all sorts of different what have you, you're trying to make a trend line to figure out sort of what's going on. When you
Mhm.
have sort of more cohesive data set, you're actually able to make more insightful sort of responses as to what that data is telling you, and how it's actually going to be sort of presented to your leadership, the board, what have you.
Mhm.
One thing that I truly think about when it comes to data is mutable. Um, data is interesting. It's something that I think that if you come in with a sort of predetermined hypothesis, you can make the numbers sort of speak to what you're trying to make them say, because
Mm.
like there are variables. And I think that's, in physics there's that notion of sort of doing things in a vacuum and like removing all of these different variables, but you can't really think that way in a real life scenario. In a real
Mm.
life scenario, you have to sort of come in like with like sort of no bias, let the data speak for itself, try not to sort of like infer, and really look at what the data is telling you, rather than sort of just massaging it to say what you want it to say. And I think
Mhm.
that's why sort of a lot of those sort of vanity metrics are things that leaders who really know what they're talking about are generally just like, I don't want to see that. That's not necessary for me.
Mhm.
Um,
That is really cool. So there's this idea of like vanity metrics, and you can mold data to kind of fit your viewpoint. So if you are biased in a specific way, your data can show that.
Absolutely. So case in point, and this is very sort of far from ops to some extent, but not
Hmm.
really. There's like a study that came out that said children who eat smaller sort of more sort of frequent meals are more often more fit.
Hmm.
And the interesting part of that is that if you actually start thinking about the real world example, if you're a kid who has soccer practice in the afternoon and swim practice in the morning and all of those other things, like you don't have time to sit down and eat a big meal, right? So it's not necessarily the food or the sort of frequency of the food that's actually inferring the healthiness. It's the sort of external factors, those different variables that you're not taking into account when you're actually looking at the data. And
Hmm.
so these insights that people sort of come to like the field with is just, it's really important to sort of think about what you're saying and why you're saying it, and if it's
Hmm.
actually a concrete sort of example. So for instance, um, if you sell to, whales more often than not, and you're really trying to grow your business to be sort of more into the sort of mid-market space, for
Hmm.
instance, and you start making insights with respect to your data today, you're making insights off of what your sales are looking like and acting like when you're selling to whales. It's an entirely different beast when you move into that sort of mid-market framework, right? And so really just thinking about it. I think that the different components are always really interesting, and I think that the way that people set up their experiments or their analyses is like
Mm.
indicative of kind of like what their thought process is when they first started, and sort of who they are and what they think about and what they don't think about and what they're missing. And I think that that's kind of, it's an interesting, it's an interesting sort of personality trait to see sort of
Mm.
who does what and what point in time. I think it's
Mm.
cool.
So it sounds like you kind of try to look at the overall picture, by trying to get to know the person and thinking about what they could potentially be thinking of. How do you make it not so complicated when you have a lot of people in your ops team or a lot of people impacting the kind of metrics that you guys go by?
I mean, I think that it's kind of like what you said. It's almost like it's really important to keep things simple. And
Mhm.
oftentimes, like if you start at your sort of base thing, like we know this to be true, kind of you can sort of work from that slowly and work away. It's that notion of sort of like a regressional analysis. You start with your ending framework that you know to be true and sort of work your way down to understand sort of that base distilled essence. And then from there, you can kind of build any which way that you want to build.
Mm. So there needs to be like either an end point or a starting point.
Exactly,
Mm.
exactly. And if you don't
Okay.
have, you can make an inference based off of gut for whatever reason, because you have to start somewhere, and sometimes you don't have the resources, the data, the cleanliness, whatever it might be, to actually start from somewhere. But it's easy if you can just pinpoint a spot and then work your way sort of back and forth, and that'll kind of give you that ethos of, I understand the base sort of case at the moment, kind of.
Hmm. Mm. Okay, so let's think about tactically and then strategically. How do you bridge that strategic and tactical divide?
I think it's actually kind of difficult, honestly. I think that there's kind of a general maybe reality that especially as ops is kind of only really recently becoming something that's more prevalent in like any business. The way that companies use their ops personnel is sometimes detrimental, such that
Mm.
like there will always be work to be done, right? Like
Mhm.
nothing is ever perfect. You can always tweak and build and like find new insights and dig into new pieces of data and build better. Full stop. You can always build better. And as a result, it's almost like the work is never done, which is kind of interesting because it's the notion of you know, I don't know if you ever had this, but when you were back in school and you sort of, going outside for lunch with friends, and in your back of your mind, you're like, I could be studying right now. I could be doing all
Mhm.
of these. When it comes to ops, it's literally they're like the job is never done.
Mhm.
And I think that oftentimes when it comes to strategy and tactics with an ops personnel, you get so sort of mired in the weeds
Mhm.
because of that tactical need to sort of accomplish things and get things off of your plate and sort of establish a baseline, what have you, so that you sort of lose that notion of like sort of strategic effort
Mhm.
or strategy. And I think that building in the right expectations,
Mhm.
building in the right kind of team, ensuring that when you start, because more often than not, you're going to start like alone, you're going to build up the baseline and then you start to grow your team.
Mhm.
Just making sure that you set yourself up for success. So for instance, like you're not going to become a leader if you're always stuck in the weeds. That's not a
Mhm.
leader mindset. That's not how you grow. But you need to be able to, you don't need to, but it's easier to be able to grow your team and to teach your team how to do a better job and to teach the business and understand the business if you've been in the muck and been above the muck and been around the muck and sort of
Mhm.
swum every single like sort of pond that there is to some extent. But yeah, it's a very sort of fine line to walk. And I
Mhm.
think that as again sort of businesses are changing, roles are changing, people are changing, expectations are changing, I think that ops is sort of leaning towards becoming more technical.
Mhm.
Frankly, I like that's one of the reasons why I've been very successful is the technical aspects that just came with my education, my experience. And
Mhm.
so I think that that technical aspect is again going to get you to that point where you can be a little bit more tactical because you're utilizing that tech ability to sort of like automate more and like build things that sort of work for scale a little easier.
Mhm.
So
That makes
hopefully
sense.
that kind of, yeah, that kind of gets you to the point where you're sort of pulling yourself out of the muck. And I, like I said, I do think that it's a general issue that a lot of people just have way too much to do. And so
Mhm.
they're sort of like hog tying
Yeah.
themselves to being this sort of like, you know, completely frenetic, hair everywhere kind
Yeah.
of.
Like Einstein, like with their drawing board and loads of like things on their to-do list. Yeah.
The equations just sort of floating in front of their eyes,
Yeah.
you know, they.
I can imagine that. So, it's really hard to bridge that gap. But if you are very technical and tactical and you've been in different positions, it kind of gives you a broader picture of what's going on. So it's a hard thing to do, but you're able to do it, especially because you're so technical.
Yeah. And I think also because, and I think, you know, it's not one of the mistakes that I've made, but it's definitely something that I've seen, which is knowing what you're capable of. And I think a lot of ops people are also sort of type A. And so we want to just sort of like finish, clean, finish, get a list to like knock those list items out of the way. And I just think that like setting realistic expectations for yourself, if
Mhm.
you hit burnout, like it's not going to benefit the company, right?
Mm.
So sort of really understanding what you're capable of, setting those expectations, and also focusing on that big picture. Because if you're in
Mhm.
the muck and you're only executing things, whether it's because your leadership is telling you to do so and you're just executing without asking, that's a very um, junior mindset, like
Mhm.
questioning and guiding and ensuring that the time is being spent wisely is something that I think is where you sort of start gaining those upper levels because you're really
Mm.
thinking about what you're doing rather than just like order, execute. Like I'm not an order taker, right?
Mhm. Mm. You think more about like the overall picture.
Really. And
Mm.
that's the purpose of operations, right? Like again, that watchmaker, like you have to see the whole thing. And absolutely
Mm.
you're diving in on occasion and you're fixing sort of different pieces, but how can you fix something like especially in a watch where those mechanisms are so closely tied in together, which is a really good analogy between a business that you can't see that if you make this sort of like change to this cog here, it's not going to break something over here. You have to have that whole picture. And if you
Mm.
don't, you're not building for scale and you're not doing the right job.
Mm. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. Using that as an example of an analogy really helps. So thank you. And so, like, talk to me more about mistakes that you've made where you haven't been able to see the big picture and how you went about rectifying it.
I think I've never made a mistake. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, never.
I honestly, I feel like the way that you sort of grow and learn is by getting that experience, and whether the experience is, you know, I really learn through sort of like by proxy and
Mm.
vicariously. So I've been able to sort of be able to anticipate things happening, which is again that notion of like you're working in strategy. You have to be playing chess, not checkers, right? And so
Mm.
you're thinking 10 steps ahead, you'll be able to, not always, because nothing's ever perfect, right? You'll be able to sort of alleviate some of the damage or collateral damage that might happen. So for instance, when you execute something, more often than not, it's not going to be perfect. If you waited for it to be perfect, you wouldn't be able to sort of push it to production like with any sort of level of haste. And again, we're
Mhm.
moving it, right? So you have to be able to deliver quickly. And so that sort of notion of I've gotten it to 80% and
Mhm.
I've like sort of thought about all the possible downsides, or I know that I've been told to do this. I've pushed
Mhm.
back on it, but it's going to happen anyways. So I know that that's going to cause a problem for
Mhm.
whatever reason right here. And so I've actually sort of set in the bumpers to make sure that that problem, when it happens, or rather like whatever sort of degree of severity, I'm already prepared for it. And
Mm.
so it's that level of sort of rehearsal and preparation that will get you to the point where you sort of, whether the mistake's going to be made, regardless,
Mhm.
you can kind of prepare for it. And so I think that like the thing that you need to be doing is sort of thinking as many steps ahead as you can. What's the worst possible case scenario? And then you're sort of set for it, you're ready for it.
Mhm. Chess, not checkers.
Exactly.
Right, perfect. And one last question for you, Ella. If you was in a room full of revenue leaders in ops, what's that one burning question that you'd want an answer to?
I am a very big sort of nerd about just what I don't know. And I think
Mhm.
that I think that there are so many aspects of the business that you may not know. Um, and I guess I don't know that I have any one specific one, but I would love to have a general conversation just because I think that there are things that like maybe I've never come across that they have. And again, that sort of learning by proxy is something
Mm.
that might actually be something super valuable. So I don't know that I have a specific question, but I definitely think that there are things that like I would love to sort of sit down and just sort of like, go down the rabbit hole and sort
Mhm.
of
I
cross
like
it.
dig into.
Yeah, exactly, exactly.